Vielleicht von Platz 18 auf Platz 1 und 4 Runden, aber ihr werdet großartiges Rennen sehen. Es war bisher großartig im Training und all dem Zeug im Keim.
On February 18th, 2001, a man who had spent 22 years terrifying and thrilling stock car racing fans took the final lap of his life in front of nearly 150,000 people at Daytona International Speedway. For most of those watching, it looked like nothing more than a routine fender bender at the end of a long race, the kind of scrape drivers walk away from a dozen times a season. Instead, it became one of the most studied, most disputed, and most consequential deaths in the history of American sports. What actually happened in that final turn has been picked apart by engineers, doctors, lawyers, and grieving family members for over 2 decades, and the full picture is far stranger and sadder than the highlight reels ever showed. To understand why this single crash still gets dissected frame by frame more than 20 years later, it helps to remember just how enormous Dale Earnhardt was to the sport of stock car racing. He wasn't simply a popular driver among many. He was, by most measures, the single biggest star NASCAR had ever produced, a man whose black no. 3 Chevrolet was as recognizable to casual sports fans as any jersey number in football or basketball. His death didn't just remove a competitor from the field, it knocked the foundation out from under an entire sport at the exact moment that sport was trying to step into the national spotlight. That collision between soaring ambition and sudden tragedy is part of what makes this story so unusual, and so many of the details surrounding it remain far less understood than the headline itself. Here are 8 things about that day and the years that followed that most fans never learned. The 2001 Daytona 500 wasn't just another season opener. NASCAR had just signed a massive new television contract, and Fox Sports was broadcasting the race to a national audience larger than the sport had ever reached before. Executives saw it as the moment stock car racing would finally break into the mainstream alongside football and basketball, competing for the same advertisers, the same Sunday afternoon time slots, and the same casual sports fans who had never given a stock car race a second thought. The timing could not have felt more triumphant. Dale Earnhardt, nicknamed the Intimidator for his aggressive, no-mercy driving style, had spent the previous season rediscovering his form after several lean years, and he arrived at Daytona not just as a legend, but as a genuine championship threat. Born in Kannapolis, North Carolina, in 1951, Earnhardt had clawed his way into racing without the benefit of money or connections, learning the trade in short-track cars before making it to NASCAR's top series in the late 1970s. By 2001, he had already won 7 Winston Cup titles, tying him for the most in NASCAR history, a mark that only 2 other drivers have ever matched. The one major trophy that had eluded him for most of his career, the Daytona 500 itself, a race he had come agonizingly close to winning more than a dozen times, including a heartbreaking finish where he ran out of fuel feet from the finish line he had finally captured in 1998 after 20 years of frustration, in a moment so emotional that even rival crews lined up on pit road to shake his hand as he drove to victory lane. By 2001, though, Earnhardt wasn't just racing for himself. He had built Dale Earnhardt Incorporated into a serious multi-car operation, fielding a car for his son, Dale Earnhardt Jr., who was just beginning to establish himself as a rising star in his own right, and for veteran driver Michael Waltrip, brother of broadcaster Darrell Waltrip, who had gone winless in well over 400 career starts and was hoping this would finally be his breakthrough season. Earnhardt was, in effect, arriving at Daytona wearing 3 hats at once: elder statesman of the sport, proud father, and team owner, with 2 cars capable of winning the biggest race of the year. The stage was set for a historic day. One way or another, few casual fans realized how close Earnhardt had come to retiring years earlier. A brutal wreck at Talladega in the late 1990s left him with a broken collarbone, and a separate crash in Atlanta fractured a bone in his neck. There were stretches where the pain was bad enough that he drove one-handed, gritting through races rather than sitting out, refusing to give any competitor the satisfaction of seeing him slow down. Drivers who raced against him during that stretch have said that even injured and clearly in pain, Earnhardt remained one of the most difficult competitors on the track to pass, simply because he refused to let his body's limitations show through his driving. By 1999, people close to him say he seriously considered walking away from the sport for good. The frustration wasn't only physical. His equipment simply wasn't performing at the level his reputation demanded, and for a driver as fiercely competitive as Earnhardt, running mid-pack in an uncompetitive car was its own kind of torture. It reportedly took encouragement from Richard Childress, his longtime car owner and friend of over 2 decades, to keep him behind the wheel. Childress has said publicly that Earnhardt's frustration wasn't really about his body giving out, but about not having a car fast enough to compete for wins. The two men had built their partnership from nothing in the early 1980s. And by all accounts, their bond went well beyond a typical driver-owner relationship. Childress has described Earnhardt less as an employee and more as a brother. Whatever the true cause, by the 2000 season, Earnhardt seemed to have his edge back, closing out the year with 2 victories and heading into 2001 with a rebuilt sense of purpose. He spoke openly that season about how much he was enjoying racing again, about watching his son develop into a serious competitor, and about simply feeling grateful for where his life had landed after so many years of grinding. Nobody could have guessed that the very driver who had fought his way back from years of injury and doubt was about to face the one crash he wouldn't walk away from. What made the outcome of that February afternoon so devastating is that it wasn't unforeseeable. In fact, it was something racing insiders had been quietly dreading for almost a year. In the span of just 8 months before the 2001 Daytona 500, NASCAR and its related series had lost 3 young drivers, Adam Petty, Kenny Irwin Jr., and Tony Roper, to an identical type of injury, a basilar skull fracture, a catastrophic break at the point where the skull meets the spine, capable of instantly cutting off the brain's control over breathing and heartbeat. Some safety researchers have pointed out that basilar skull fractures had already claimed the lives of more than a dozen drivers across different forms of motorsport in the years leading up to 2001. Including competitors in Formula One, drag racing, and IndyCar, which meant the danger wasn't unique to NASCAR. It was a problem the entire racing world had been slow to solve. Medical experts and engineers had been pushing hard for drivers to adopt a new piece of equipment called the HANDS device, short for head and neck support, a carbon fiber collar that attaches to the driver's shoulder harness and helmet, designed to stop the head from snapping forward violently in a frontal impact. Early versions of the device were bulky, uncomfortable, and unfamiliar, and many veteran drivers, Earnhardt included, resisted it. He was famously blunt about his feelings on head restraints, at one point dismissing the entire category of equipment as unnecessary and confining, arguing it interfered with a driver's feel for the car. NASCAR held safety demonstrations that week specifically to showcase the device and address driver concerns, bringing in outside safety researchers to answer questions and fit interested drivers on site. Several prominent names in the garage attended and were fitted for the device that same week. On race day, only a handful of the 43 drivers in the field, reportedly as few as 5, were wearing any kind of head and neck restraint at all. One of those 5 was Kyle Petty, still grieving the loss of his teenage son Adam to the exact injury the device was designed to prevent, a fact that made his decision to wear it less a personal preference and more a decision shaped by unbearable first-hand experience. The tragedy of February 18th wasn't a freak accident nobody saw coming. It was a known, named risk that most of the garage, including its biggest star, had simply decided not to guard against, largely because the equipment was new, unproven at the highest levels of stock car racing, and deeply unfamiliar to drivers who had spent their entire careers without it. With about 25 laps remaining, the race was thrown into chaos when a multi-car accident tore through the field on the backstretch, collecting roughly 20 cars, nearly half the entire starting grid. At the center of it was Tony Stewart's car, which launched into the air after a violent chain of impacts, flipping end over end and landing on top of another competitor's hood before rolling to a stop in the infield grass, from the grandstands and from the broadcast booth. It looked like the kind of wreck that no driver could reasonably be expected to survive. Fans watching at home held their breath as the car came to rest, smoke pouring from the wreckage, debris scattered across the track. Remarkably, Stewart climbed out under his own power, shaken, bruised, and clearly in pain, but alive, and he was able to walk to the ambulance himself. An outcome that felt almost miraculous given how the crash looked on camera. The race was red-flagged briefly while track crews cleared the wreckage, giving everyone in the field and everyone watching a few extra minutes to process what they had just seen. What many people don't know is that Earnhardt, watching from further back in the field, radioed his team owner immediately afterward with a warning that would prove chillingly prophetic. According to those who heard the exchange, he told Richard Childress that NASCAR needed to do something about the safety of these race cars, or the sport was eventually going to get somebody killed. It was the kind of blunt, matter-of-fact statement Earnhardt was known for throughout his career, not panicked, just direct. The assessment of a man who had spent 2 decades reading danger on a racetrack better than almost anyone alive. Within roughly half an hour, he would be gone, killed in a crash that, ironically, looked far less violent on television than the one he had just warned about. Perhaps the most overlooked part of the story is what Earnhardt was actually doing in the closing laps of the race, with Michael Waltrip running in first place and Dale Earnhardt Jr. running second. A 1-2 finish for cars owned by Earnhardt's own team, the Intimidator, made an unusual choice for a man famous for refusing to yield position to anyone under any circumstances. Rather than fight to hold the lead himself, he dropped back to third and spent the final laps functioning almost like a rolling roadblock, weaving between lanes to cut off any driver trying to make a run at his son or his teammate. This is a detail that gets lost in most retellings of the story, but it says a great deal about who Earnhardt was in that final stretch of his life. He had spent more than 2 decades building a reputation as the most ruthless closer in the sport, a driver who would rather wreck than concede a position. Yet, in the final laps of his final race, he chose to give up his own shot at victory in order to shield the 2 men he cared about most. Sterling Marlin, Rusty Wallace, and Ken Schrader were all pushing hard from behind, looking for any seam to slip through, and Earnhardt held them at bay lap after lap with the same fearless high-speed blocking that had defined his entire career, refusing to give an inch even though he had nothing personally to gain from the effort. It meant that in the race's final and most dangerous moments, one of the most successful drivers in history was running defense rather than chasing a win, putting himself directly in the most vulnerable spot on the track, sandwiched in traffic, absorbing every attempted pass, right in the middle of a tightly packed group of cars, jockeying for position at nearly 200 miles per hour. Commentators calling the race that day repeatedly praised the drive as one of the gutsiest defensive performances they had ever witnessed, with no idea that they were describing the final laps of Earnhardt's life. As the field came through the final turn on the last lap, Sterling Marlin tried to dive below Earnhardt's black No. 3 car to make a last run at the front, threading his car into the small gap along the bottom of the track. Earnhardt moved down to block the run, defending his position out of pure instinct after 2 decades of doing exactly that thousands of times before, and the 2 cars made contact by most accounts, a relatively light tap, not a violent collision. The kind of brush that happens dozens of times over the course of a single race without any consequence at all. But that small contact was enough to break Earnhardt's car loose from underneath him. It slid down toward the flat apron at the bottom of the track, and for a brief moment, it actually appeared to be correcting itself. The nose swinging back toward the racing surface as if Earnhardt might simply gather it up and continue on, the way he had done in countless similar moments throughout his career. Instead, the car shot back up the banking directly into the path of the cars racing 3 wide behind him, with nowhere left to go and no time left to react. Ken Schrader, running close behind and unable to avoid the sudden change in Earnhardt's trajectory, struck the passenger side of Earnhardt's car, and the two vehicles were sent together into the outside concrete wall. On television, it looked almost unremarkable, a glancing, sideways impact, nothing like the airborne violence of the Tony Stewart crash earlier in the day, and nothing that visually resembled a fatal accident. Broadcasters didn't even initially treat it as the day's biggest story. Attention in the booth was focused on Michael Waltrip's approaching first career win. That appearance was deeply misleading. Reconstruction experts who later studied the accident in detail, frame by frame, using the car's onboard data and physical evidence from the wreckage, determined that Earnhardt's car hit the wall at close to 160 miles per hour, striking at a sharp diagonal angle rather than head on a geometry that engineers say produces some of the worst possible forces on the human body, because the impact combines forward deceleration with violent rotation of the head and neck rather than a simple, straight-line stop. The entire sequence, from first contact with Marlin's car to the moment Earnhardt's vehicle came to rest against the wall, unfolded in well under a second, which is part of why so few people watching, including the drivers directly involved, initially understood the severity of what had just happened. Investigators who reconstructed the accident found that Earnhardt's car decelerated by roughly 40 miles per hour in about 0.08 of a second, generating forces described by some analysts as in the range of dozens of times the pull of gravity comparable, by certain estimates, to dropping the car nose first from the height of a 5- or 6-story building onto solid concrete. Numbers of that scale are difficult to picture in human terms, but the practical result was that Earnhardt's body, restrained by a lap and shoulder belt system, was thrown forward and to the right inside the cockpit with a violence that no amount of conditioning or experience could have prepared him for. Investigators later found that the left side of his lap belt had separated during the crash. And this single detail became the subject of a bitter, years-long public dispute that played out in newspapers, courtrooms, and television interviews. NASCAR's own medical consultant, who examined the autopsy photos and represented the sanctioning body at several press conferences afterward, initially theorized that the broken belt allowed Earnhardt's body to travel further forward than it should have, causing his chin to strike the steering wheel and his head to snap backward into the seat's surround with enough additional force to cause the fatal injury. Simpson Performance Products, the company that manufactured the seatbelt, strongly disputed this account and faced significant public scrutiny in the aftermath, even though an internal examination suggested the belt itself may have been improperly installed rather than defectively made. An independent biomechanics expert who reviewed the case for a Duke University crash injury analysis reached a different conclusion after studying the autopsy photographs directly, that the fatal whiplash-style injury to the base of Earnhardt's skull would very likely have occurred even if the belt had held, because the violent rotational forces on his head and neck were the real killer, not the belt failure itself. In this expert's assessment, the crash Earnhardt suffered was simply severe enough, and the angle of impact unfortunate enough, that the outcome may have been unavoidable regardless of restraint equipment. Both experts agreed on one grim point. However, a full-face helmet, unlike the open-face design Earnhardt wore throughout his career by personal preference, would not have changed the outcome, and whether a hands device could have saved him remains something even the specialists directly involved in the case have never been willing to state with full certainty. What is not in dispute is the physical toll the crash took on his body. Earnhardt suffered a basilar skull fracture, essentially a ring-shaped break at the point where the skull connects to the spine, an injury capable of instantly severing the brain's ability to regulate heartbeat and breathing, along with 8 broken ribs, a broken left ankle, and a fractured sternum, injuries that taken together still weren't as instantly fatal as the skull fracture itself. which doctors say almost certainly killed him before the car had even come to a complete stop. To the crowd in the stands and the millions watching on television, the wreck didn't look catastrophic. Earnhardt's car wasn't on fire, wasn't crushed beyond recognition, and had simply slid to a stop in the infield grass, the way dozens of crashes had ended over the years, with the driver climbing out and waving to show he was fine. But Ken Schrader, whose car had come to rest right beside Earnhardt's after the collision, knew almost instantly that something was deeply wrong. Instead of giving the traditional all-clear wave that drivers use to signal they're uninjured, Schrader climbed out of his own damaged car and began frantically motioning toward the incoming safety crews, urging them to hurry rather than take their usual unhurried approach.